Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. Hey everyone, I'm here with Dave Calleja. He's the head of design at Isobar. Dave, thanks for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day. I know it's hard to do these over a Pacific Ocean. Dave, I think you're coming to us from Melbourne, right?
That's correct. And thank you, mate, very much. Very excited to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, we were talking a little bit before the show, kind of trying to get an understanding of your role and what you do. Why don't you just kind of tell us about, kind of what a head of design at an agency works on and how that relates to design systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my case, I share the responsibilities for head of design with a colleague of mine, Miles, who's based up in Sydney, and collectively we're responsible for looking at the capability growth and the current strengths within our discipline, within our craft across the entire agency. And really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do there is make sure that the skills, the capability, and the competencies that exist within the design discipline at Isobar are the right mix of those things to do amazing work for our clients based on the current needs and trends.
Gotcha. So you end up doing a lot of work with a lot of, large enterprise organizations, and that very frequently ends up putting you in a position where you're looking at the establishment, the creation, the adoption of a design system. What does a project like that typically look like, and kind of who are the folks that you're interacting with there?
Yeah, so the fact of the matter is that within an agency environment, within an agency context, as you said, is that we don't know what the needs of those organizations coming to us. We might have a startup one day, and tomorrow we might have, a global FMCG organization, or an e-commerce organization who's or a fast food group, someone who's got such a massively diverse range of needs. And so a huge part of what we need to be able to do is to be really flexible in meeting what they might have an already very established design discipline. They might have no designers at all internally. And so they might be on an established technology framework. They might be starting from scratch. We need to be very, very flexible. That's probably the overarching consideration.
Gotcha. Yeah, I definitely remember those agency days where, you never really knew what you were walking into in terms of the maturity of an organization, in terms of their capabilities. And having to be that fulfillment of whatever needs or gaps exist in the organization was oftentimes really challenging, because it's all about trying to right size your effort with the needs of the customer. When it comes specifically to the design system side of things, oftentimes I assume that means that you're actually helping these organizations stand up these systems, either for the first time or taking a nascent or rather early stage design system and really trying to grow the adoption of that across an org. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. What we're finding more so in the last 2 to 3 years is there might be, as you said, some kind of nascent design system or an understanding that they need that capability within the team. Whereas 3+ years ago is that you were still very much fighting the battle of this is why you need a design system, or this is the importance of having one within your team. Now they understand that need, but they don't really know how to create it, and if they don't have that maturity internally, which on the whole, most organizations by number globally don't have that capability internally just yet. I'm sure that's going to change in the next 5 to 10 years. Our role is to say, well, what are the needs? How can we help you build this capability for your team and ensure that it doesn't dissipate in 3 months?
So that's interesting. You talk about like 2 or 3 years ago, not really having folks that really understood what a design system was or what its value was, to now starting to see people that are actually presumably requesting these things of you all. And so that shift has been something that has definitely been rather recent.
Absolutely. I think the shift has been, I could probably draw a line in the sand, as I said, sort of, 24, 36 months ago. And it's been quite a stark change, mate, where the situation is that it was very much an uphill battle to convince organizations to fund or to consider stopping work to create this seemingly distracting project. Whereas now they understand that what it's actually enabling us to do is, as us design system people who love talking about this stuff know, is that it's an enabler, and it's very much being seen as that through the efforts of, your Atlassians and your Googles and your Apples and your Netflix people of the world who are showing the path forward and making it aspirational.
That's awesome. And so that transition from, basically people not really understand what these things are to actually having budgets and line items associated with design systems, what has that really done in terms of changing the way that you work inside of these organizations? So, I recall when I was first implementing what I didn't even know were design systems when I was a part of an agency. One of the things that was always a challenge there was it fundamentally changes some of the nature of the work, because you're then starting with this system that is then going to feed all these different downstream digital products. And so step one is not like, how fast can we deliver on that first big site? Step one is, let's go set up a system that enables the creation of all these other sites faster.
Yeah, that's right. So I think acknowledging, firstly, there's an anxiety within these organizations still to this day, very much so, that if we start to embrace this, if we start to take the time, the effort, the budget to create a design system or something around this capability, is what does that mean for what we promised stakeholders or shareholders in terms of the roadmap and the features and the pipeline of those promises that have been made, that have already been agreed to, right? So how do they continue to do that and deliver on those promises whilst building capability and building foundations so that they're not there isn't this sunken cost fallacy where they've produced all this work and then they're going to have to go back, and it makes it harder and harder to sort of add design system capability into the mix.
Yeah, that sort of debt that accumulates as a part of that project. And so, when you're thinking about this and you're looking at these projects for your customers and for the folks that you're working with, are you encouraging them to seek funding for design system line items, and how are you helping them do that? Because I imagine, we run into this relatively frequently too, where you have a team or a part of an organization that really understands it, that gets the value, that has those champions. And then once you find that champion, it's about helping them talk to their executive team, talk to their leadership about how they get budget for something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you've still got very much two scenarios. You've got something where there's been an executive buy-in, that sponsor has arranged budget, and they're coming to you and saying, we know that we need a design system, or we know that we need to build this capability, whether that be technology or team or whatever it might be, help us do that. And that's a very sort of separate mindset, and that's a very specific way to approach building that capability. The second one, as you just sort of talked about, is you're probably working on something else. Maybe you're working on redeveloping the commerce platform or relaunching an app or whatever it might be, a project, right? And you need to use that as the catalyst to show what the value of building the design system and capability around that is. And in that case, that's where you're sort of looking for that evangelism. You're looking to use that as a way to demonstrate the strength and demonstrate the value that's going to bring. And we work very closely with the project stakeholders there and say, well, look, this is the way that we have to work. We're not going to work for you on a project without having a systemized mindset into what we produce, because we know that's going to be better for our developers, your developers, our designers, your designers, everybody involved in the project. So how do we use this project?
I love that. Yeah, I love the idea of basically insisting upon having a systems-based approach to the work that you're doing, because I think that there's a lot of folks on the agency front and on the services front in general that have been a little bit wary about systems like these and have been cautious to wade into them, partly because of that stakeholder promise thing that you brought up earlier. And also part of the thing about it introduces a lot of risk and uncertainty in the delivery of a project. And so when you sit there and you think about hey, I'm going to go spend, $500,000, $1 million, whatever, on standing up this system, this centralized, thing that serves other things, and the value that delivers to an end client, a lot of agencies and service folks get really nervous and potentially rightfully so about how that affects the way they bill, how that affects the way they scope and envision a project. When you think about that scoping side of things, I mean, you brought this up early on in the conversation. It's a lot about that teaching moment, right? That idea of how you de-risk these engagements is through teaching people how to use these systems. Can you expand a little more on that and talk a little bit more about how you think about the right way to take a look at these sort of new ways of working and make it so that they're very successful for your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just sort of that mindset, reducing that anxiety or reducing, I guess a more positive way to look at it is, how do we increase confidence that you're going to understand what the known quantity is here? What is it going to take in terms of effort and time to get you up and running and to start to build this capability? And that's where that flexibility, that unknowingness that we talked about at the start of the conversation from an agency point of view becomes a strength. Come to us knowing that We've worked on this massive diversity of technology platforms and design tooling and whatever it might be, and so we've got that knowledge, and so that's why you come. That's where the benefit is. In terms of the approach, is that we really think about it in three lenses. Product, which is for all intents and purposes being the design system, the thing itself. The service, how are people going, the service design lens to this, how are people going to actually engage with and use this so that it's meaningful, it's making their day better and not more cumbersome. And then that third part, which you just touched on, which we call team uplift, which is like the actual capability itself. How do we coach? How do we mentor? How do we, advocate and evangelize what this is going to do, why it's valuable, and why this is going to be meaningful and helping you actually achieve, the customer vision that you've got.
Yeah, and I think that one of the other great parts of this is the ability to kind of unpack those three different traits. And so, you see a lot of these, right? And there's got to be commonalities from system to system to system. What are the common points that you see across those three different dimensions? And how do you really leverage those into a model that generates like repeatable success?
So where I think we've gotten to with this cottage industry around design systems is we've gotten to a level of maturity. It's no longer about the pattern library. It's no longer about these, sketch libraries or Figma libraries or atomic components that exist in a front end library somewhere. They're all incredibly important still, obviously. But I think where we've gotten to that's most important, and the thing for me that personifies everything that we're trying to do here, is language. How do we communicate between teams, notably technology and engineering and design teams, what the experience intent is, so that we spend more time talking about how to create that experience and less time talking about what the hell we mean by those things.
Absolutely. Amen. I love the idea of, this shift from these old philosophies of print design, of websites are just posters that you can resize, into this idea that design is a lot more about the expression of intent than it is about the expression of perfection in an implementation. Because now there are too many screen widths, there are too many devices, there are too many different ways that users can consume that experience to be able to fully express them all in design tools. And so there's a limitation there that's kind of inherent in the medium that we're talking about, which is code. And I think that that's, when people have asked me, does a design system belong in code and design? The answer is both, but ultimately what the user consumes is that code. And I think that expression of intent is a great way to put a point on what modern design is all about.
That's absolutely right. Understanding what the desired intent is, and at the point that it's consumed, it is in fact in code. So in order to make sure that experience fidelity at the point that it reaches your customer, your user, is its highest possible from the time that the design and the team intended it to be that way, you have to remove opportunities for signal loss, for things being lost in translation. And the only way to do that really effectively is, as we just sort of touched on, is to make sure that people are, as often as possible, speaking not only a common language, but a shared and understood language. And it must be shared. It can't just be common. It can't just be a middle ground. It needs to be something that there's ownership of across technology, across product, across data, across legal. Everybody needs to know what those things mean. And not all of those things are going to be shared. Some things like component names might just be shared between design and technology, but other things like tone of voice, they must be shared between design and experience and legal, so that you don't get legal feedback saying, well, part of the experience is how we talk to customers about a change in fee, and suddenly they're using different terminology. That's part of your experience language in your design system as much as any code component.
I love that. And I think that that's wonderful because it does have this great sort of triangle that you've laid out there between the product, the service design, and the uplift. And that service design element is so essential for the spreading of that language and the unification of that way of speaking throughout the entire organization.
Yeah, for us, it's fundamental. And I think it, in years gone past, that really came from a point of frustration where, with the best of intentions, and, we've learned a lot as we've come as an industry and as individuals, is that we started by saying, well, here's a design system. And, that by that, we mean that here's some code libraries. And maybe, if you were an early listener to Brad Frost, you had an atomic library up and running in code as well. Right. And that's great, fantastic, because, being on the shoulders of giants and all that. But where we're at now is that we're in a very different place. And if you create something and nobody uses it, it's providing no value. And what we saw is we would create design systems historically, and it would be great. Look how fantastic. Let's go have a beer and celebrate. And then 3 months later, it's not being used, or it's becoming a zombie design system, and it's not evolving. It's not being contributed to. It's not providing the value that someone paid all that money to see it provide.
Yeah, and we see that same thing where you have almost this hangover from adoption, right? So there's all of this time and effort and energy that goes into the creation of the initial system. There's, all those wonderful steps that Brad and others have outlined about interface inventories and, the build out of the initial components and the piloting and the adoption. And then after that, things are achieved like this climax, these peak levels of excitement inside of the organization. And then, like you said, 3 or 6 months later, you start to see this slump where maybe usage drops off, maybe all of a sudden there's far less contribution than there was previously. How do you avoid that slump? Like, is that a part of the services design concept as well, or is that something different?
No, I think it is. So I think it's shared across the product, service, and uplift. But in terms of what's leading the charge in making sure that it doesn't drop off and doesn't become that zombie system, is the service design aspects, or at least what we consider to be the service design aspects. And for us, that really culminates in mapping, creating, and validating the processes that people use to ensure that the teams can work together. Because if you spend all of the time up front just doing the component auditing and then creating a bunch of components, and you come up with 4,000 of them and the variations, and it's all seamless between between Frontify or Knapsack and the design tooling or whatever it might be, and then that's it, and nobody knows really how to use it. I can give my dad a Lamborghini, but he's going to stall the thing like 4 seconds down the road, right? Like, that's fine. That doesn't make him a race car driver. It certainly doesn't make me a race car driver as much as I'd love it to make me. So you need to actually spend enough time up front, as much time in balance on the product, as well as within the context of that organization. How do your teams work together? How do they communicate? How are you actually going to go through the process of contributing? So what we do now is very much, as we're building the system, those people have to be involved. It has to be an inclusive process, and we focus on producing less components that are inclusively designed so that there's ownership from day one.
So tell me a little bit more about that inclusivity and that necessary moment where you have the engagement from all of these different stakeholders. Like, that's understandably challenging to pull off. So how do you, first of all, what does that look like when you have the full team engaged? And then secondly, how do you really pull that off? Because I know I've struggled with getting the right people in the room, if you will. And that's largely because, people are busy, there's competing priorities, there's all these other things about a design system. Forcing it is not necessarily something that's right, especially given how far the ripples of a design system go through an organization. So how is it that you evangelize to get those people interested and excited and in the room to go through this service design process?
Yeah, that's, you've touched on something important there, which is it's in order to get everybody's time equally, that's a fool's errand. You're not going to get every single person across the organization who you might wish to have knowledge or understanding of the value involved in equal measure. What you can do is make sure that at moments in time is that you can get their input, get their feedback, you can showcase. And largely speaking, there's a lot of agile practices based into that. There's no reason that you can't use something like a Google Ventures design sprint to make a component. And if you look at Sprint 2.0, which Jake Knapp and the team have kind of released, what we love about that is that instead of requiring everybody to be there for a design sprint, there's moments in time where they might need to be there for the showcase, for input, for some part of co-design. That mindset is equally true for the way that we approach design systems. Legal don't need to be there for all of the, and marketing probably don't need to be there. But if you try to produce components which marketing are going to use to create landing pages for a new product launch, and you release new components, and they're like, well, how do we show the 3 different product variants that we've got for launch? And you're like, oh, yeah, maybe that's a contribution. You've already lost the battle. Whereas if you start by including them at a right moment in time, and you then produce a component which meets their needs, and you've only produced 10 as opposed to 1,000 components, and I'm being hyperbolic, but if you've produced a limited number of components, but those are solving real problems, you've got that human-centered design aspect to design systems, which really needs to be there, is that you're going to solve real problems. And that's what's going to get that marketing manager to speak to the head of marketing to say, we need to be contributing to this more.
Right, because then they feel like they have a ownership of that process and ownership of the end result of what you're building.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting to think about the idea of all of these different organizations that you've worked with that have this service design model baked into this inclusivity baked into it. Are there other key ingredients that you've seen, especially related to maybe other parts of the process, like the team uplift, that handoff? And the reason why I pick handoff is having had some agency experience, there's this tendency for an agency to come in, spend a year, maybe 2 years with a customer, and then sort of fade into the background. And as that fade happens, your touch and influence and guidance in an organization dissipates along with it. How do you make sure that it's there for the long haul? Yeah,
so I think just to touch on that last part, the agency sort of fading into the background, we're very much in the business now, and something I'm very proud of is we're constantly trying to put ourselves out of a job by virtue of whatever this project is, whatever the context here. Let's take design systems and say, what you have asked us to do is to come and help develop and build this capability within your organization. If we're still trying to do that in 2 years, we've failed. Right? If we're still doing if that's the role that we're performing in 2 years' time, or even 12 months' time, different scales of organizations notwithstanding, then we've probably failed. What is a much greater incidence or example of success is that we've come in, we've spent a specific period of time helping build up that capability, and now your team is using it and developing it, and it's evolving, and then we're helping you move on to the next thing. And maybe it was initially the focus was on getting those core foundational aspects of the design system up and running, and now it's maybe helping adopt into other departments or other brands within the organization or something like that. And that's a signal of success, that you've evolved what the remit is. If we're still doing exactly the same thing, that's probably not so good for anybody.
Yeah, that's actually what Knapsack takes as like our biggest wins, is when you see our system not just within one team or one department inside of an organization, but having them evangelize to other departments inside of the organization and other teams that then adopt the system. I've always taken that as a huge mark of success, just generally, that the design system is working, people are finding value in it, and they want to spread that value to other parts of the organization.
Yeah, if you can have a look at that thing that you've helped create, and it's in a really positive way unrecognizable than the thing that you initially created, for good reasons. Those good reasons being, democratized contribution, optimization, learning, insights have been integrated back into the design system and components have changed, or the, tone of voice or the branding has changed, and it's been able to then come in through the design system and express itself through every touch point within the business because of how integrated it is, then great. If I don't recognize it in 12 months or 18 months, excellent. That's great.
That's great. That means that somebody else owns it that isn't you now.
Yeah.
And I think that spreading of the wings, if you will, is a great feeling when you can look back and say, like, hey, I mean, a part of me is here, but I don't recognize it.
Yeah, you want it there to be core DNA there, and that's where I think that the language, how people are doing things, and which of course should evolve as well, but that's the more important thing to get right. If ultimately, the first components that you deliver can be completely, quote unquote, wrong or not meeting needs. Ideally, they shouldn't be, but that's less important than making sure that the service and the systems that are in place, the technology, the way people are working, the way they're communicating, the team that supports it, that's foundational. That's core. If you don't get that right, then nothing's ever going to work. Whereas if you get that right the first time, or you create a foundation to fix that and to evolve it, then you can fix other problems around the system far more easily.
So I think it's really incredible that you've had the experience that you have working with all these different organizations, building design systems, approaching it from this very service-based mentality, looking at sort of the human-centered concepts around it. When I think about the endpoints, the poles to a design system, on one side you have design tooling, design ops. On the other side, you have like downstream applications, you have DevOps, you have all of these other aspects that are more associated with code. When you start to examine away from the middle and you get into those poles, how does a design system really impact those teams and those people? Like, what changes about the tools? What changes about their day-to-day work that you've really seen have a major impact as a result of the work you've done in these systems?
It's such an exciting time to be a designer from a technology and tooling perspective, not just because of, you might be designing for Oculus or for this incredibly powerful, phone in it that everyone's got in their hands. You just don't know what you're going to be designing for. There's such a breadth, back in the day when you were designing on a 960 grid for basically one monitor size. And, that was, that was just like the target, what you were designing for. That was a very different world. So it's very exciting. But at the same time, it's such an incredible space to be in from the technology that's coming to the fore. There used to be one option and that was pretty much it. And now there's multiple places and they're finding their role in the world. And that's great. At the same time, the last 12 months has shown us the importance of being able to communicate across teams, remotely and across different scenarios so easily, and things like Figma and all these cloud-based tools for designer technology that just were unheard of previously. It's really showing how important it is to be able to seamlessly send that intent that we talked about earlier through shared tools. And so something like the design systems package for me is one of the most important and exciting things, the standardization of design systems through the W3C. And I know that, the knapsack's heavily involved and Adobe's really doing some great work in terms of pushing for that, to say, here is a standardized way to be able to take design systems information from any place and provide and send it to any place in a known and standardized way. That's a level of maturity that, as that cottage industry that we talked about, is really sort of identifying that there's a level of maturity that's being reached and sort of peaked here. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, maybe moving into spec homes instead of cottages.
Yes, that's right.
No, in all seriousness, though, that friction point of handoff has been something that people have been trying to solve for a long time. And I think that trying to solve that with handoff tools where, you're sending a little bit of CSS or you're sending a little bit of design or some color swatches back and forth isn't really the right way to do it. The way to do it, the most appropriate way, is to remove that friction point altogether through a more truly integrated workflow where designers are able to work in the space that they're most comfortable, like Figma or something like that. And then developers can work in the place that they're most comfortable, like VS Code or Xcode or Android Studio or something like that, and have that information at their fingertips that is much more seamless than, let me go, to this handoff tool and grab this file or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I know firsthand from speaking to developers in our team that doing handover in a place like Figma where they're working directly on the designs, that's fantastic for them. But that's, in the grand scheme of things, that's so pedestrian compared to where I know that we're going to be able to get through things like, design system packages and other work that's being done. And, I know this term was sort of coined, I think it's an Airbnb term, but, sort of painting with code. We should be in the scenario where there is this completely synchronous scenario where, to your point, whatever context I find myself in, whatever environment I'm in as a designer or a developer or a content author, right? So when I'm in the CMS and I'm trying to, spin up that landing page and I want to make sure that that's right, and I want to then have a conversation with the designer or the developer about which component I might use instead, that should all be one seamless conversation, which is why, I feel like sometimes a broken record, and my team will certainly tell me this, but, it's why having a common shared language is so critical above all other things.
Yeah, I really, really believe in the content story. I feel like there's an entire frontier of design systems that is just scratching the surface there, where, if you think about back end, front end, and content as the aspects that make any web application or native application in general, that content leg of that stool is something that is pretty still unexplored in the systems context. And I can't wait to start to see how design systems move into that content space to create a lot more structure and systems-based processes in that area.
Yeah, the role that content plays and the role that content authors and people who are responsible for creating content, like marketing, and their involvement with design system teams, I think it has been historically very much overlooked. And it partially because there was so much work to be done foundational, like how does a component actually work? What does it do? Where does it sit? But now we've very much reached the place where we have to be involving these people in order to really see continued and evolving impact of design systems, because otherwise it's just going to be that we're going to reach a limit in terms of how effective it can be in achieving the goals or changing the behavior of users within the experience, because the content is what they're there for. The old adage of content being king is incredibly true. We've got this nitrous-powered system capability behind it now, but the content's kind of just puttering along because we haven't connected the two meaningfully yet.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I couldn't have said it better. I think that the other side that things are getting interesting in is the connection to DevOps and the connection to a lot of the downstream application side of things. It's really taking a systems-based approach to building these downstream applications has really fundamentally changed the way that we think about how we construct these apps. Talk to me a little bit about your experience there and kind of how you see the future of that end product owner that is using a design system and ingesting those components to then, build an app for a user.
Yeah, so I think in our context and in the type of work that we do, for us, the design, the DevOps side of things is most coming to the fore when you're starting new projects or a new part of the business is adopting that system and therefore also starting a new project. And what you need to be able to do there is, as quickly as possible, get into a position where you've got a good fit. So many of the things that we have now within design systems there's a known baseline. There's not as many unknowns as there was 12, 24, 36 months ago. Mm-hmm. I think what we need to do is understand that the value of creating a design system now is not in redesigning the form element and the button component. We know enough about the baseline parts that exist within the system, how they should work together, the best-in-class tooling. There's decisions to be made, but it's not something that we should be spending weeks and months on, especially in the context where you come to an agency and say, what's best in class right now? Let's start there. There's a good level of confidence. Let's understand what are the specific challenges that exist in your organization, the specific challenges that exist in your experience that you need to solve, and work on those things. Unless you've got good insight to change how forms work, don't mess with it right now. I'm not saying all forms should be the same. I'm definitely not saying that. I'm saying have insight like any other thing that you do, any other way that you prioritize around any other product you've got. Use that insight to inform the work that you're doing. And if the biggest challenge right now is, showing people which insurance plan to sign up, spend time on the components that go into that part and not the payment page and then confusing people just because you want it to be different. And I think that allowing people to start with that baseline through a dev and design, a well operationalized design system as quickly as possible, so that a new designer, and this is a test, right? A new designer or developer starts in your team. How quickly do they understand what they need to do, get access to all the libraries and technology, and get into the systems as quickly as possible? And if that's not day one, it's taking too long.
Yeah, they need to be able to make a contribution almost immediately based on the resources that should be just at their fingertips. And this actually gets to a really interesting point that we talk a lot about, is this idea of putting barriers and hoops in front of your design system. Lots of people try very hard to keep these things sort of behind the curtain. They put them behind, single sign-on portals or VPNs or very deep inside of the organizational framework. And so it makes it hard for people internally to access them, let alone agency partners, folks that are external that are working with their systems. And we've always been a huge advocate of a very open nature to a design system because it helps people be able to adopt it and understand it more quickly. And I think, you probably are the same mindset as me, but I'm curious to hear your take on the openness of systems, and in the number of systems that you've seen, is there a trend towards those open systems being more successful?
You're absolutely correct in terms of understanding the impact or the severity of issues that are going to be caused in a closed environment. If the entire purpose here is to be an information radiator and to share knowledge and to communicate, putting barriers between that is only going to cause issues for you. And certainly in all of the technology decisions that we've made across and the recommendations that we make, even when they're being integrated within, a client's organization, is how is this information going to be shared? How are people going to have access to it? And that means still being aware of privacy and security and PII and all those kinds of things. But there are pretty seamless solutions to that. Don't store private data on your design design tokens. There's no reason to have customer data there.
Yeah, don't have your color palette named after a patient's name.
Correct. Yes, that's probably ideal.
Well, hey, Dave, this has been really fantastic. I know I've learned a lot. Absolutely awesome conversation. We always like to kind of try to wrap these up with thinking about how design and systems thinking has sort of infiltrated your day-to-day life. So do you have a personal anecdote to share about how systems thinking has sort of wormed its way into your everyday life?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that for me, embedding myself in this sort of mindset for such a long time now, for relatively such a long time now, is it really has become just sort of the baseline for how I think about solving problems. And most of the time that's really good because I think about, how can things be reusable? I don't want to that's really positive, but I think I can fall into that scenario, unfortunately, sometimes, hopefully not too often, where I'll say, okay, well, I'm making a deck or a presentation, or I'm working on this project, and everything should be systemized and everything should be reusable. And I think sometimes...
Oh, design systems have made me so much better at Keynote.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that's fantastic. But I think where it can get in the way sometimes, particularly as a designer, is sometimes you actually need to throw all of that away and not be constricted by any system at all and just throw everything to the wind and then immediately come back and work out what those things are. But I think... just completely sort of wrapped up in systems thinking all the time. Everything needs to be reusable. What is the benefit of creating this new thing? Why do I want to create that new thing? And having insight for that has really helped me say, why am I doing this thing? Is it actually valuable?
Yeah, that thoughtfulness that comes with kind of the base understanding of I'm not just designing for myself, but I'm designing for all these other people that inherit the work that I'm doing. I think that innately creates like a mindfulness inside of folks that is very different, I think, than when you're designing for a specific purpose or use case in an end app, right? When you think about how far and wide that work is going to go, I think it has a very different mindset that you take towards it.
Absolutely. I think if you look at design files now versus 5 years ago, that's like that mindset has really crept in. You can see that the way people, the way that people annotate things, the way that people keep layers named, it's not perfect, but it was a very private sanctum in Photoshop 10 years ago. And now knowing in Figma that everybody can see what you're doing all the time, it's a community space, it's a communal space, it's a shared place to be. And so you need to design accordingly. And I think on the whole, that's a really positive thing.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks again, Dave. Really appreciate you being on the pod, and look forward to talking again soon.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed being here.
That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.